Okay, let's go. Kevin, go for it.
Good, Kevin.
No, I'm not saying that.
It takes up time, too.
Judges ready? Timer ready? Okay. Today I will be debating on whether or not the UN has been successful in keeping peace and stability throughout the world. First, let me explain what the UN is and what it does. The UN is an international organization that currently has 193 member states. The name United Nations was coined in January 1st, 1942 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Over time, the United Nations has become a mechanism for governments to find areas of agreement and solve problems together. The UN, on June 26, 1945, signed their founding charter. The founding charter was a list or a book of what the UN was allowed to do in certain situations, their members, their systems, and their assemblies. The UN has done the following things very well since they have replaced the League of Nations. First is food aid. The UN's World Food Program is among the most effective multilateral bodies in the world. They feed people in war zones, natural disaster situations, health emergencies, and poor countries, and also third world countries. Second is protecting children. The UNICEF has built a reputation on the advocacy and service powerhouse with programs ranging from immunities to AIDS preventions to education and protecting against exploitation. Third is peacekeeping. The UN has over 16 active peacekeeping missions right now. Although the UN's peacekeeping is checkered for at least two reasons. First is vague mandates and inadequate resources decreed by the countries on the UN Security Council, and second is poor planning and their capabilities. Dr. Abe Babatunde Thomas is a coordinator of the UN System-Wide Special Initiative on Africa. Dr. Abe Babatunde Thomas says that the UN was designed to rationalize the UN assistance to Africa through more effective coordination, capability building, and facilitating genuine partnerships.
I'm being questioned by.
No, you have 1 minute, 30 seconds.
Affirmative.
Affirmative?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not what it says in here. Okay, whatever. I am messed up. 70 years ago.
Hold on, wait, say.
Judges ready? Ready? Best be ready. Ready? 70 years ago, the UN was formed on bringing bringing up world peace after World War II. 193 countries are involved, as we previously said. Our main goals: child mortality rates, decreasing child mortality rates, providing health in countries, and maintain gender equality. All these things have been done. Decreasing child mortality rates has gone down by 90 million. 90 million children have been saved by either to abuse in general or saving them from dying of hunger. There are 69 peace trains helping for preventing conflict. He said 16 peace trains. Those are the main that could cause a war. There's other smaller peace trains going on. If conflict does break out in a country, there are 100,000 troops ready. I know it doesn't sound like much, but this is the power force of Canada. but so yeah, 100,000 troops. Smallpox was completely eradicated in 13 years since they started, and the UN has won 11 Nobel Peace Prizes throughout the 70 years of its working for the world. This is the strongest reaching and well-respected global peace striving organization of the world, and there's no doubt of it. My question?
I question you. Okay. We have a minute, right? Judges ready? Time ready? What is the relevancy of these humanitarian efforts to the UN's core mission statement of the maintenance of international peace and security?
Can you say that one more time?
What is the relevancy of these humanitarian efforts, such as disease fighting and gender equality, to the UN's core mission statement of the maintenance of international peace and security?
So obviously there's always going to be two sides to the thing. There's going to be conflict wherever out you go, and there's simply, you can't stop that. There are going to be disagreements, and if you can't stop two countries from fighting just because of their differences, there are other things to focus on children and women. So there are always going to be conflicts and wars going on. And yes, that is our main goal, but simply it always can't be fixed.
So Kevin spoke about. Okay. Judges ready? Time ready? We are resolved that the United Nations has been unsuccessful in its mission statement of bringing the maintenance of international peace and security. The UN has been presented with many challenges over the years and has consistently failed to step up to the plate, thus leaving others to clean up the mess. The first major test of the United Nations' strength was the Korean War. This was an utter failure. The UN security force was literally almost kicked off the Korean peninsula by a poorly trained and poorly equipped North Korean army. The only thing that saved them was the invasion of United States Marines. The protection of Korea is often hailed as one of the UN's best achievements. The reality of the outcome is that nothing changed and the status quo remained the same, despite some 5 million civilians and soldiers dying. The Koreans are still technically at war because they only signed a ceasefire agreement, not a peace treaty. The organization has also failed in preventing worldwide spread of nuclear weapons. When the United Nations was created, the United States stood as the solitary country that had developed the atomic bomb. Just 4 years later, the Soviets had also developed and tested nuclear weapons. Despite signing a non-proliferation treaty, many countries have continued to develop and stockpile these weapons of mass destruction. This is because of the inability of the United Nations to enforce rules and regulations that they themselves created. The continued possession of the nuclear weapons by rogue nations and oppressive regimes has put the world in a state where a nuclear holocaust is a constant possibility. The UN and Cold War were both born out of World War II, and the closest the world has ever come to nuclear annihilation was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The logical conclusion one would come to would have been the UN step in, because after all, their mission statement of maintaining peace and security was being threatened. What did they do? They cowardly stood on the sidelines and pleaded with John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev to not nuke each other. The UN told the world that they were going to disregard their own mission statement and let the parties involved take whatever course they chose. The event in which the world as we know it could have totally been destroyed was ended because of good negotiating on behalf of JFK, not because of the UN. Fast forward to modern day, and the threat of a terrorist organization or a radical country like Iran getting their hands on a nuclear warhead are ever increasing. The UN has not been a major supporter of anti-terrorism operations. Despite the organization condemning terrorism, it has failed to take the needed actions to stop the spread of extremism. Nations like Iran, the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, are actively supporting groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Terrorism must be funded by someone or something, and the UN has done nothing to stop this. Despite the United Nations developing legal restrictions to fight terrorism, the threat has not diminished. The UN's broad and ambitious mission statement is what gets them in trouble here. They are an organization best suited to dealing with conflicts between governments, but with the majority of conflicts involving terrorist organizations and militias, the UN is outdated and not suited to handle this task. The United Nations peacekeeping operations is one of its more powerful instruments that it has used to maintain peace and security, yet they are often unsuccessful. Personally, I find it ironic that so-called peacekeeping missions are armed with tanks and machine guns, but that's besides the point. In 1995, the UN deployed a peacekeeping force made up of Dutch soldiers to a region in Bosnia called Srebrenica. The UN immediately had this area designated a safe zone, and would be protected by these peacekeepers. The invading Serbians started to pick off supply trucks that were headed for the enclave. Food, water, and ammunition was beginning to run low, and things were getting desperate. Then, on July 6th, the Serbs launched a massive assault that completely overwhelmed UN forces. Locals literally built barricades to stop UN tanks from retreating from the firefights. Genocide and rape ensued in the aftermath. Later in 1995, the UN pulled all of its troops out of Somalia after the Black Hawk Down incident in Mogadishu, marking one of its biggest operational failures. It is unreasonable to expect one country or one organization to maintain world peace, but that is exactly what the UN mission statement says, so that is the standard to which it will be held. Because of the broadness of the UN's mission statement, we are resolved that they have been unsuccessful in the maintenance of international peace and security.
It's Kevin. He's finishing right now. His question.
Judges ready? Timer ready? Okay. So how many UN soldiers do you think were in the Korean War?
I'm not sure, but I know a large force was made up of United States soldiers that were under a Korean or a UN mandate that were fighting, and they were pushed all the way back to Pusan in southern Korea.
Okay, but didn't they also fight back to go forward into Korea?
Yeah, but that was after the U.S. Marines had invaded at Incheon along the 17th parallel. That took the attention away from them.
How do you expect what would you expect for the UN to do if they're not holding tanks and stuff to keep peace?
I don't know. I mean, that's just. I think it's a funny name for a operation. If it's called a peacekeeping operation, you're coming in with tanks and machine guns. I don't think that's really like showing the locals that yeah, we're here to keep peace, but you know, you might also get caught in the crossfire. That is it.
That was fast.
Judges ready. Timer ready. Okay. In terms of preventing the war that has not been achieved, it is unfair to say that it has failed, just because the conflict hasn't been totally eradicated. The UN has been an effective forum for diplomacy in many international crises. It has also come to the aid of countries which have been attacked, such as Korea and Kuwait in 1950 and 1999. Since the UN establishment, armed conflicts have been less common since 1990. The UN was created during World War II by Franklin D. Roosevelt for the main purpose of preventing future wars, and it has done so by Korea and Kuwait. In terms of the UN disregarding human rights abuses, the failure of preventing genocide from the Rwanda genocide went unstopped not because of the UN's fault, but because of the international community, specifically the neighboring countries, such as France. And this should have been intervened, but it isn't the fault of the UN. The decision-making process is sort of slow in there. This is inevitably going to happen because there are nearly 200 members in one body, and this will obviously occur. Just because some processes are slow, it doesn't mean that we should totally abolish them, which is insane. And some would say that the UN bodies are corrupt or compromised. Although this is true, but like any other organization, there's always going to be some corruption. Although if we totally eradicate them, then their nations are going to be left to the fault of the nation. Like, they can treat their citizens however they want without the UN. So if the UN keeps them in their body, then you can have some influence and sway. And in terms of international cooperation that takes outside the mainframe or the framework, this is true, but it is still a necessary forum to discuss global affairs. Many international organizations work closely with the UN. For example, when the International Atomic Energy Authority evaluates the compliance of nations like Iran and Iraq, they directly report to the UN Security Council. In conclusion, this debate is primarily about whether or not the UN has failed, but even if its decisions are made outside the UN body, it doesn't reflect badly on them. Also, in addition, there are some programs such as refugee aiding.
Time.
That's-
Judges ready? Time ready? Okay. Humanitarian issues like child sex abuse has been a big failure in the UN. They claim they would make this a focus of theirs, but they haven't made any drastic change. The other point brought up about gender equality has no relevance to the preserving peace and security. Another failure of the UN is Israel. The UN says that Jerusalem should not be the Jewish territory. They've attempted many times to pass assembly resolutions against Israel. There are 193 nations in the UN, and over a quarter of them are Muslim nations. The UN Human Rights Council has constantly condemned Israel. According to UNWatch.com, from June 2006 to June 2016, the UN Human Rights Council has come up with 135 resolutions criticizing countries, and 68 of them were against Israel. Instead of nations like China that forces abortions on citizens, or North Korea, who is a prison state, or places like Venezuela. This shows the UN's lack of prioritizing and extreme bias. The UN's main focus is on war prevention, not humanitarian issues. So in that sense, they have completely failed in their task to preserve peace and security.
Judges ready? Okay. So yes, the UN has had mistakes in the past. Like you guys did say, crossfires with local civilians. But we have recently stopped those goals because, yes, more people would die in the process. We are finding ways to try to fix that and prevent it. But that comes with time and decision. Going back to the food aid, 40% of child mortality rates have gone down from hunger. If you told that to someone in 1990, 1980, they would not believe you a bit because that was such a big problem back then. No one would ever think that world hunger would at least come to half of a decrease that it is now. And one thing I would also like to say, I think of the UN as like insurance. insurance, the flood insurance. No one thinks they need it until it actually happens. So going into that, I think the UN is trying everything it can to help, but there will always be conflict, always be problem, and there's always a negative to look at. It's much easier to look at the negative than the positive in anything. So, and recently, our new president has gone into some actions of his own to try to stop different terrorist organizations. And it has gone out of control, but in time, I feel like it will come to an end. So, is the time on? Okay.
Okay, judges ready? Okay, timer ready? Okay. This is the affirmative closing. So, back to what I was saying about the programs of refugee aiding. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, founded in 1949, helped about 17 million refugees. The officers actually directly assisted them, like they went into the field and helped them for whatever they need. And the UNHCR has won 2 Nobel Peace Prizes, respectively in 1954 and 1981. And in conclusion, the UN hasn't totally failed in its primary mission of preventing wars. And it has also been a global forum and has helped in peacekeeping and aiding citizens around the world and other international communities. Okay. Time.
Judges ready? Time ready? Okay. So overall, the United Nations has utterly failed in their mission to preserve peace among nations. They stayed on the side and failed to complete their mission while a worldwide crisis was being brought to a head and JFK had to resolve the conflict. Their first major task, being the Korean War, was a complete failure. The poor involvement in the Korean War did not change the status quo and left 5 million civilians and soldiers dead. North Korea is still an oppressive communist nation with nuclear powers, and it wasn't until President Trump got involved till North Korea even considered denuclearization and ending the Korean War. Child sex abuse is another failure of the UN. It may not be in the category of war prevention, but it is still something that needs to be looked at to preserve peace. Many nations have brought up this issue to the UN, and the UN said they would make this issue a focus of theirs, and yet they have failed to make any drastic change. The UN has also failed to prevent terrorism. Terrorist groups are being funded by nations like Iran, and the UN has done nothing to stop this. Israel has been a major conflict among the UN. The UN was heavily against President Trump's decision for the US to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. This shows the extreme bias of the UN. The UN has also not done anything when it comes to nuclear weapons. Despite many nations signing non-proliferation treaties, nations still end up having more and more nuclear warheads, and the UN has done nothing about this. The standard at which the UN is being held may seem a little unrealistic, like an unrealistic standard, but the standard is set up by themselves, and so that's the standard we will be holding them to. It's pretty clear that the mission to preserve peace, world peace and security has been a failure from the UN.
Good job.
Thank you. Are we supposed to like shake hands and give each other like a
Yeah.
little gift or something like that?
If they did it for judges, if they didn't do a cross-examination, grade that as like, same lines, just give them a grade as long as reputation. Or the same as reputation. All right, good job, guys. Now we see how it's done. So.
Yeah, it's not back to call for you guys.
Wait, is someone else going today?
Everyone did reputation. Well, Sam didn't quite though. So if they just did cross-examination and not reputation, grade the cross-examination as reputation. Okay, does that make sense? The two go together. So someone did do reputation, they did cross-examination. Someone didn't do cross-examination, they did reputation.
Were those 1 minute arguments like in the middle? Were those the rebuttals?
No, the 3-minute one that Kaikoa